Good afternoon, and thank you for joining us for our third installment of Reimagining Black History Month. Today, I am excited to introduce a dynamic speaker who hails from the great state of Michigan, the great city of Grand Rapids, and the great high school, Ottawa Hills High School. Dr. Mark Hopson is the Director of African American Studies at George Mason University. Also, he is Associate Professor of Intercultural Communication. His research and publications cover critical intercultural communication, rhetoric, diversity, and the communication of violence prevention. Select publications include the following. Dr. Hobson co-edited a book titled Reimagining Black Masculinities, Race, Gender, and Public Space, published by Rowman and Littlefield. Also, Dr. Hobson co-edited the book titled Masculinity and the Black Imagination, Politics of Communicating Race and Manhood, published with Peter Lang. Additionally, Dr. Hobson wrote a book titled Notes from the Talking Drum, Exploring Black Communications and Critical Memory and Intercultural Communications Context, published by Harper Press. And currently, Dr. Hobson is completing a book titled His Name is Duke, Communicating with At-Risk Youth. I'd like to present you our speaker for today, Dr. Mark Hobson.
Greetings. How am I coming across? Hope you all can hear me and see me. As was mentioned, my name is Mark Hopson. I am Associate Professor of Intercultural Communication and Director of African and African American Studies at George Mason University. I have an area of expertise which looks at communication and the Black experience. And before we get into this presentation, I should mention to you all that I need to thank a few key people. This includes Mr. Lionel Legrone, Ms. Shamara Tumblin, Carl Hordick, Caitlin Rigdon, Jane Bruin, and all the good people at Calvin University. I also need to acknowledge and respect my GR family and friends. So the title of this presentation is The Value of Black History Month, Education, Awareness, Diversity, and Social Justice. It is a response to the question of what is the value of Black History Month. I seem to be getting a bit of a echo, so I'm not sure if production can attend to that. Anyway, so when we ask this question, what is the value of Black History Month? We are able to respond in a few ways. We consider what is the value of Black History Month to people who identify as Black or African American? What does it mean to people who are non-Black? What does it mean to students and other organizational members? I think that the way in which we should conduct this presentation should offer some answers to that questions that you all can use in either teaching or learning about this topic. And so the answers include what you see before you: education, awareness, diversity, and social justice. Now, certainly each one of these subjects could be its own talk. For example, as a communication consultant, when I facilitate on organizational diversity, much of our training centers on understanding that diversity is much more than difference. In fact, diversity is more about responsibility for how that difference matters, and taking responsibility for the contributions and even the potential success of difference within the organization. Now, that example is an offshoot from our discussion on the value of Black History Month, but the example is worthy of mention because it is an implication of a larger structural issue relating to Black History Month. So if any organizations out there are seeking information, my contact info is at the bottom of this slide and also appears again on the last slide. So let's get into it. What is the value of Black History Month? Let's start with education. Teaching and learning about Black History Month requires the connection to the continent of Africa. Indeed, history begins in Africa. African civilizations date back to the origins of human existence. Some of the oldest skeletons, some of the oldest bones are found in East Africa and Northern Africa. For example, we know that Lucy goes back millions of years. So this would suggest to us that if individuals and cultural groups and societies inhabited East Africa and Northern Africa, then certainly the earliest advancements in art, science, law, and other forms of life, social life that is, also extend back to ancient Africa. Keeping that in mind, history does not end or begin with that example, because we know that today the continent of Africa continues to be one of the richest in the world. And that wealth includes diamonds and gold and oil and minerals. Minerals that you yourselves can find in your cell phones. For example, the tantalum for your cell phone is something that we all have in common. Now, when we think about history and we think about Black history and we think about Black History Month, education is certainly part of the continuum. Let's also consider American slavery and the prosperity obtained from that, right? So let's begin with this. Teaching and learning Black History Month begins with the idea that enslaved Africans were human beings, not slaves, right? Language matters. We don't want to dehumanize, minimize, or objectify human beings. As an example, many of us have heard the current administration advise people to not refer to coronavirus as the China virus, or using terms like illegals. Again, language matters in shaping reality. So begin with the idea that Africans from Africa were enslaved as human beings and not necessarily minimized to being a slave. Also, when we think about American slavery, we know it begins prior to 1619. There are arguments for as early as 1550 and even in the 1400s. But for the sake of our argument and our time today, we'll look at the way in which it's framed around the arrival in Jamestown. We know that has to do with 1619 up through and beyond 1865. So consider this: 250 years of free labor which transformed Southern wilderness to prosperous plantations. Indeed, American slavery made these colonies and made what would become the United States of America one of the wealthiest countries in the world. So wealthy, in fact, we were called King Cotton. And I don't doubt that everybody out there watching today is wearing or near cotton right now. So let's think about the fact that American slavery brought great wealth to the colonies and to Britain through cotton and tobacco crops. Now, history did not end after 1865, and American slavery continues to impact us today. There are connections with this inherited wealth. For example, in 2000, Aetna Insurance acknowledged policies that insured enslaved Africans in the 1850s. So we know that it did not end with 1865, and this too must be taught. Now, why does Black History Month matter? Beyond education, it also has to do with awareness. Now, I'm going to call this slide Two Nations. And I'm not a pastor, but if I were, I would preach from the book of Mark, chapter 3:25. Wherein the authors tell us that a land or a nation or a body that is divided and competing cannot stand. I also want to refer to the summer of 2020, where we experienced an epidemic within a pandemic. All right, and when I say the epidemic, I mean the unlawful killing of Black bodies or the riotous violent attacks on the US Capitol during the pandemic of COVID-19. Now, we can define epidemic as a fatal phenomenon that is quick and widespreading throughout a particular community. For example, the United States. We can define a pandemic as a fatal phenomenon that is quick and widespreading throughout a larger global community. So I suggest to you that both terms apply to the killing of Black bodies within US America and throughout the globe. This is an idea I explore in my most recent book. The idea is not limited to the physical body. In fact, we're also talking about killing bodies of knowledge within and surrounding the Black experience. So Black History Month is about American history and serves as a reminder that times may change for better or worse. So what have we learned from the horrific deaths of George Floyd, Sandra Bland, Trayvon Martin, 12-year-old Tamir Rice, and our GR family, Breonna Taylor? Well, we know this: without knowledge, we are destined to repeat history. So it is important to inspire within the next generation a truer understanding of history's impact on life today. It's also important to understand how Black History Month contributes to next steps for health and well-being in US America. So here I'd like to reference a book titled Two Nations, Black and White, Separate, Hostile, Unequal, where Andrew Hacker described competing realities for white America and Black America, including competing expectations, competing opportunities, competing laws, and a competing sense of security. Now, Hacker's sentiment is nothing new. In 1903, W.E.B. Du Bois predicted that the challenge to America would be the challenge of the color line. According to Du Bois, those of us who know the color line would also know a sense of double consciousness. Later, Martin Luther King also referenced what he called the other America. King argued that the social, political, and economic disenfranchisement of Black people was inherent to systemic racism. And as I mentioned, in the Gospel of Mark 3:25, Jesus states, "And if a house be divided against itself, that house cannot stand." Although separated by years, Hacker, Du Bois, King, and Jesus share a common idea. That is, until these issues are addressed, these issues will continue to haunt America. Thus, any change requires that we adjust our thoughts and our actions. And that, of course, is one value of Black History Month. Now, also in terms of awareness, includes this idea that we begin to understand history within current contexts. So every February, college professors like myself are tasked with reminding students about the significance of Black History Month. No doubt many people understand that this country has been strengthened by recognizing the various contributions of ethnic groups representing its social fabric. However, there are too many times when I'm reminded of a sense of apathy among students who are influenced by a dominant ideology that positions Black History Month as more of a chore than an opportunity. To those students, I say that Black History Month is about American history. It's also about a time where we find ourselves today. It's about understanding that race and racism are not mere coincidence or figments of our imagination. It's about the reality that students can graduate from middle school, high school, and yes, sometimes even college, with little to no knowledge of the African American journey. Black History Month is about civil and human rights. It's about economic justice. It also reminds us about Black achievements, including those of Benjamin Banneker, the self-taught mathematician and part of the research team that would survey the territory that eventually became Washington, D.C. It also includes achievements by Rebecca Lee Crumpler, who in 1864 became the first African American woman to become a doctor of medicine. And it also includes GR's own Roger Wilkins, 1973 Pulitzer Prize awardee, and the U.S. Assistant Attorney General to President Lyndon B. Johnson. Certainly, many students are less familiar with these individuals. So Black History Month serves as a reminder that as times change, they may get better or they may get worse. Again, I ask, what have we learned from the horrific deaths of India Cager, Eric Garner, Jacob Blake, Jordan Davis, and Ahmaud Arbery. Without awareness, we are destined to repeat history. And it's important to inspire awareness within the next generation. So looking at the slide, we begin to understand that Black History Month speaks to consciousness and awareness, but it also informs us on racism and anti-racism, anti-Black racism, and white supremacy ideology. Now, in terms of awareness, in terms of teaching and learning Black History Month, obviously you have to include the work, the vision, and the foresight of Dr. Carter G. Woodson, whom I like to liken to a visionary. He was the original definition of being woke, or what we consider to be an influencer. Dr. Carter G. Woodson was founder of AFAM Studies in many ways, having contributed to the study of the Black experience, along with W.E.B. Du Bois and others. Also a Harvard grad, second to earn a PhD after Du Bois. Dr. Woodson is a historian, an educator, and a dean at Howard University. Would go on to found the Journal of Negro History and wrote one of the seminal books for understanding the Black experience, which is The Miseducation of the Negro. Now, one of the quotes that I use oftentimes in class from that particular text is this idea that, quote, if you can determine what a man will think, you will not need to worry about what he will do, end quote. So again, Carter G. Woodson is looking at this idea of killing the body, the Black body of knowledge and experience having to do with the Black experience. So we understand that Dr. Woodson is also the founder and the creator of what would be called Negro History Week. And the idea was birthed within a social structure that failed to acknowledge Black achievement. The Negro presence had long been minimized in business, politics, education, law, and other areas of social life. We know that Woodson scheduled the week according to the birth dates of Frederick Douglass and Abraham Lincoln. So consider the symbolism here. Even the name itself flew in the face of oppression. Woodson's Negro History Week was meant to frame a space and time to popularize the contributions of Black people in the midst of legal and illegal efforts to eliminate those contributions. Woodson hoped that the annual event would inspire the world to shake off what he considered to be mental chains. Now in 1970, students at Kent State University proposed a Black History Month. Extending the week month increased opportunities for additional thought, discussion, and vehicles for change. Symbolically, the word Black even itself sought to connect and empower people across the country and around the world. Black also became a proper noun when referring to racial and cultural identity. And by 1976, Grand Rapids' own President Gerald R. Ford urged the nation to recognize the accomplishments of Black Americans in every field of human endeavor. Now, these collective efforts speak to uniting two Americas. These ideas speak to the very definition of diversity. So, Black History Month and diversity. Understand this. Carter G. Woodson never meant for Black History Month to be limited to educating only Black people. His goal was to educate all people about Black contributions to the world. And what does it mean to regulate learning to specific groups of people? I mean, for example, next month we have Women's History Month. But can Women's History Month help educate everyone regardless of sex or gender identity? Or can National Hispanic Heritage Month help educate everyone regardless of ethnic identity? So these designated months emphasize the struggles of people who fly below the radar far too much. These are times for people to come together for the sake of learning. Knowledge is the goal. A lack of knowledge leads to ignorance, ignorance leads to apathy, and apathy leads to irresponsible action. Society won't need specific heritage months when we eliminate racism, sexism, homophobia, and other forms of oppression that minimize the value of all lives in general and in this case, Black lives specifically. So until then, I will continue reminding my students about the significance of Black History Month. But understand this, Black people are non-monolithic, meaning that we don't all agree. Some of us do not agree with the idea of Black History Month. For example, the great actor Morgan Freeman has openly expressed his opposition to naming a Black History Month, suggesting that it should just be part of American history, and American history which is taught every day. I can understand and respect that position, but I also understand other arguments that suggest that this is a luxury that Black people don't yet enjoy. So regardless of one's position, race and culture are ongoing topics of American discussion, what many have called the talk about race and racism. Now, when we think about diversity and having talks about race and racism, I want to call your attention to the slide before you. To have this talk requires that we understand definitions and concepts. In other words, that we have some sort of agreement about that which we are talking about. And so these are terms that are oftentimes here used by students in my courses. And I have no doubt that you all are seeing these terms used either in social media or in your own networks. So think about this for a minute. Prejudice, discrimination, racism, and privilege are common terms which are oftentimes conflated. But I suggest to you that if these were all the same terms with all the same meanings, then we wouldn't necessarily need different terms for them. So I'd like for my students to remember this. When we discuss prejudice, we're referring to personal opinion and bias for or against individuals and groups. Now, a personal opinion is just that, it's personal. It doesn't have to hinder anybody else, right? There is a personal opinion going on at pretty much every moment of your life. For example, you might not like my black sweater, but I don't care. That's your personal opinion. That is your prejudice against my black sweater. However, discrimination is action based on a personal prejudice, based on a personal opinion, and based on a bias for or against individuals and groups. So if I'm made to sit in the back of the classroom based on my black sweater, now that is discrimination because it is an action based on that personal opinion or that prejudice we discussed momentarily. Next up is racism. Racism would be the prejudice and the discrimination combined and enacted in a way that is structural, systemic, and societal. It is this and the implementation of prejudice and discrimination for or against individuals and groups. So it doesn't take an individual in the room for me to understand that my black sweater is less than appreciated. As a matter of fact, there might even be laws, written and unwritten, that keep me from entering certain organizations or certain spaces based on my black sweater. That's what we mean by structures and systems and societal. Again, it moves beyond the personal and it moves beyond the action to implement a structure that doesn't require anybody standing there telling you what to do. It's hegemonic by nature. Last but not least, we have privilege. Privilege is an unearned advantage based on social identity. So we have a racial privilege, we have a gender privilege, we have class privilege, we have sexual identity privilege, ability privilege, information privilege. But again, all of this is based on social identity, meaning it's nothing we've done ourselves to earn that privilege. It's because society has placed a certain value on a social identity. Therein lies the value enacted by that social identity, which is what we call privilege. So if we're having discussions about race and racism, and if we're looking at anti-racism, for example, it's important that we have a better understanding of the terms we're using as opposed to conflating those terms. So how does all that impact social justice? And how does all that impact where we are today? Or as you see on the slide, Yesterday impacts today, I would suggest to you. And I would also argue that Black History Month has everything to do with social justice. It seeks to address ways that people are marginalized structurally by racial, ethnic, and cultural identities, right? So it highlights, it foregrounds achievements, not only to empower the group in which it's referring to, but also to educate and make others aware of those achievements. All right. And also recall what I said about the killing of the Black body and the Black mind. Social justice is about restoration. And in many ways, Black History Month is also about restoration. It's about restoring ideas, it's about restoring achievements, and it's about restoring the goals that were lost based on oppression. All right. And Dr. Woodson's plan for us includes social justice, right? The idea is to educate and inform to the point we're able to make a change in the world around us. So understanding the history of America as connected to racism, capitalism, sexism is an important part of not only social justice, but emphasized through Black History Month. And both also help us to consider lessons learned and next steps. So as we begin to conclude our short time together, I'd like to offer some information for next steps. We oftentimes hear efforts at anti-racism. We talk about social justice. We don't necessarily understand how to do it though. And so what I want to do is borrow from a simple model that has been used repeatedly throughout academia and beyond. But I'd like to use these six steps to encourage and empower individuals who really want to enact liberty and freedom, right? So first and foremost, this model calls for us to employ self-reflection. In other words, begin to understand how we are impacted by societal power, right? Either we're empowered or even disempowered. Take a serious look at ourselves, take a look at our lives, and begin to make the connections to others. Number two, re-envision the surrounding world from other perspectives and recognize other cultures as lending to that world, right? Black History Month begins to push us to re-envision the contributions that create the United States of America, and indeed, that help to create the world. Number three, be willing to contribute to intercultural interactions. All right, that means not avoiding, that means not minimizing opportunities to interact and learn from people who aren't necessarily like you, be it in the classroom, be it in your workspace or your everyday affairs. Four, care about those intercultural relationships. Move beyond the point of just being introduced to these ideas and these individuals, but care about it, learn about it. Make an effort to become better by information. Oftentimes use this example with students. You know, ignorance isn't necessarily about an insult. Ignorance is simply not knowing something. And we don't want to be ignorant in our intercultural and in our interracial interactions. Number five may be difficult to define, but I say to you all that you have to decide how you enact this. Reject racial privilege. Reject it. Reject it where you are, in your social environment, in your networks, however you choose to do that. Reject racial privilege. And number six is probably the most important step. It says that we must move from admission of power and privilege to action. In other words, after listening to this presentation and after listening to this phenomenal program put on by Calvin University, what will you do next? Are you going to sit with the information and consider yourself smarter or wiser? Or are you going to use this information to make the world a better place? That, my friends, is the question. What will you do with it? Regardless of what you do, I implore you to act. So with that said, I have come to my last slide. And that last slide has to do with discussion questions for you all. I like to entertain any of the questions before you, but these are things that might get us talking about things that we may not have considered before. So, in your opinion, what is the value of Black History Month? In your opinion, what is the value of Black History Month? Second question is, describe your feelings about Black History Month. Do you have any memories to share? I recall growing up and not necessarily spending too much time on what we call Black History Month. I mean, there may have been some effort at home, but we might not have had as much in the classroom. And so, as a father and as a husband, I've tried to instill value for the Black experience, not only during Black History Month, but certainly um, upping the game, as you say, for my kids, students, family members, friends, and even those of you who follow me on social media. You know that I'm always trying to share something that will inform you, educate you, and enlighten you. So my memories have to do with really becoming more responsible for the way in which this history matters. And as an educator, I'm always trying to share. Third question, can you offer current observations of the talk in US America? Certainly there's enough in the news these days. I am going to stick to the question on this part as opposed to offering my observations and my answers. And that last question would be more of a statement asking you to describe specific challenges or suggestions for talking about race and racism. Describe specific challenges or suggestions for talking about race and racism. Now, I'll come back to this slide in a minute, but I want you all to know that anytime we have these discussions, I'm always using sources, academic sources preferably, and I'm always suggesting to students that if you have another opinion, if you have an argument, I'd like to know your sources. And even better yet, write it up. All right, so I'm sharing some sources with you, and then last but not least, as I said before, my contact information is before you. I can be reached at hopsonhpc@gmail.com, or you can follow me on Twitter at mhopson1. And there before you is a picture of our most recent publication having to do with Black masculinities, plural that is, and exploring what that experience is all about. So I am going to go back to my questions. And as I do so, I am going to thank you for your time. I appreciate the opportunity to be before you. And I just say to you all, let's engage.
Thank you. Thank you, Dr. Hopson. A lot of information there, a lot of knowledge. I want to go to Q&A, waiting for some questions to roll in, but in the meantime, I do have a question for you as we're waiting for the Q&A to queue up. With regard to the value of Black History Month, do you see an overall value in Black History Month when you look at society as a whole? Let me try to ask this differently. Recently, there was something going around social media. Some guy in our home state, nonetheless, running for governor. And the only thing that we know about him, he's a Black man. He is originally hails from Nigeria. The only thing we know about him is his platform is that he wants to abolish Black History Month. So I guess the question is twofold. First, if that were to happen, which I don't see it happening, but if that were to happen, how would we suffer? What would be the social and economic consequences to the abolition of Black History Month? And secondly, why do you suspect that we actually have people of color that would actually have a platform, specifically a Black man that has a platform running for the highest office in the state under the platform that we should abolish a month that celebrates our history?
So I'm getting a delay on my end, and I may have missed some of your questions.
Okay.
I'm going to respond to what I heard.
Okay, that's fine.
So in terms of doing away with Black History Month, I think one thing that we've learned in the past years is that race and racial issues are certainly politicized. In other words, it's all about the politics, and in many ways, it's about followers and it's about gaining support. So part of what we're hearing, I think, is an attempt to gain some support outside one's community. But also consider this. Black History Month has to do with acknowledging the history of a people who have literally been in bondage for 350, 400 years, right? If we think about even from 1619 through 1865, we're thinking about 250 years. And then we think about legalized segregation as another 100 years. Now we're talking about 350 years of basically legalized oppression, right? And so what bothers me about that notion of abolishing Black History Month is this idea that we can afford to do away with opportunities that one recognize our history, that recognize our achievements, and that put those achievements in the foreground, right? So I don't think that we can, even if you want to say that after the Civil Rights Act, that there was some huge progress made, and even if you want to use President Barack Obama as evidence of progress, I don't think you can say the 100 years of progress that you might want to argue about, less than 100, I should say, is putting us in any position to do away with efforts to not only meet but surpass centuries of oppression. So it seems to me that whatever acts are occurring to abolish Black History Month would be one of politics. But again, Black people are non-monolithic. We don't all share the same ideas. We don't share the same values. The topics we're discussing now in my intro to Advanced Studies class is the idea of being a Black liberal versus a Black nationalist and even a Black socialist, and what those ideas look like, right? Those values may have some similarity, but they also differ. And we can look back at American history and see the way in which examples of particular ideologies have played out in the lives of individuals.
Thank you. Thank you for that. I have a question here from Gaddy. Gaddy says, please explain the benefit to rejecting white privilege rather than the dominant community sharing their privilege.
Please explain the benefits to rejecting privilege rather than sharing privilege.
Please explain the benefit to rejecting white privilege rather than the dominant community sharing their privilege.
Okay, again, I'm getting some feedback, so I'm going to respond as best I can. First and foremost, white privilege is an extension of white supremacy ideology in the sense that, and let's use these terms responsibly, in the sense that values, ideology, philosophy, experience, etc., associated with whiteness are empowered systemically, structurally, and based on the society in which we live. And in many ways, those experiences have been empowered to the degree that they've disempowered other individuals. Supremacy ideology, it is a power, it is a force that does not require you to stand in and say, I am enacting this force. It is simply working. So the only way to stop this force, the only way to disrupt this force is to reject it actively. Some of us will work hard to share it. But the history that we know of in the United States of America is that it's not easily shared. And part of sharing requires you to give up a part of who you are, be it your culture, be it your language, be it your religious conviction, be it the way you walk, talk, even the way you eat. So understanding this requires that we act. Again, let's look back at that model. It requires action. And the action is to disrupt and ultimately dismantle any type of oppressive power based on race, sex, gender, class, ability. Because to sit back and do nothing and hope for it to work out is literally condoning it through silence.
Thank you. Can you hear me okay, Dr. Hopson?
I'm getting an echo.
Okay. I have one more question for you. I'll try to go slow. Hopefully, you can hear this one a little better. Amanda says, I've seen references to Black History Month and African American History Month. What's behind that difference?
Black American History Month and African American History Month. Great
Black,
question.
Black History Month versus African American History Month.
Wow. I have you now.
Want me to read it again? Amanda says, I've seen references to Black History Month and African American History Month. What's behind that difference?
All right. So we talked about race and racial identity being politicized. What other cultural group, what other racial group has gone through as many changes and name changes, to be exact, as Black people, right? We began as Africans. We come to this new land and our names are taken. We're given names, and some of those names include Negro, color, right? We even avow the name Black or African American for different reasons. Each of those reasons is for access to a certain resource, right? Regardless of what the resource might have been at that time in history. But I would suggest to you that regardless of what we call ourselves, we are still the same people. And at what point did we cease to become African?
Thank you. Thank you for that. Okay, so I don't see any more questions here. I'm going to give it a couple seconds, and if none come in, we'll go ahead and close out. Okay, well, I want to thank you, Dr. Hopson, for joining us today. This has been, and thank everybody that logged in and tuned in, and the recording will be on YouTube within the next 2 or 3 days. Thank everybody for logging in. This has been the third installment of our Black History Month speaker series, Reimagining Black History Month. I want to thank everybody for joining us today, and you all have a great day. Bye.